So the first thing I would sort of say there is that these kinds of vocabularies, whether we're talking about a Persian one, whether we're talking about a kind of one of Roman inheritance, are kind of a wide palette upon which people can draw at different times and in different ways. And what's important about distinguishing, let's say, Kaiser Rum versus this other vocabulary is that the gesture towards a Roman imperial inheritance is part of a very particular and even narrower moment of Mehmed II's reign, and it's not one that resonates continually in the same way throughout the 16th century that this other kind of vocabulary does. And then sort of related to that, I mean, language really does matter a lot, and also in this sense kind of shared kind of cultural or historical interaction matters a great deal. These terms that I am dealing with, in some sense, needed to be translated for an Ottoman context, but in another sense, they were intelligible, or more easily intelligible. I mean, I've seen Ottomanists argue that Sahib Quran is deployed against the Habsburgs, as if Ferdinand in the mid-16th century is trying to be Sahib Quran. I mean, maybe you can speak to this, but I very much doubt that Ferdinand cared anything about Sahib Quran. And it's in that sense that this vocabulary is intelligible, yet innovative, in a very particular context, which is broadly Islamic, I would say.
Okay. Stan?
Okay, so I have...
Just introduce yourself to Chris before you ask your question.
So I'm Stefanos Georgianos. I teach European history. I'm especially interested and excited about your presentation of sovereignty here. I had two questions, more or less. The one was whether you would care to compare the work that you have done here to work around millennial sovereignty in elsewhere in Islam. For example, in Asfar Moin's work on the millennial sovereign and the Mughals and the whole concern of that, whether that is a related trend or if you would have particular senses of how that issue would play out. The second thought was, I wonder whether you went a little fast, maybe for purposes of the talk, on the concern about Ottoman Turkish at the end. One would have also anticipated that there are key questions, perhaps conflicting with the ones that come from this Persian tradition in establishing understandings of sovereignty, and that these would have been established specifically through this Ottoman Turkish linguistic and palace idiom. I wonder to what degree that would be a matter not merely of translating the Persian ideas into Ottoman Turkish, but something else. I'm going to stop there.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, those are two very good questions. I mean, in some ways, my work is related to, Asfar Moin's work. I sort of accept in broad measure a lot of what he's trying to do there. But the first point that I would make is that I think that we need to sort of expand the imprint to include the Ottomans. I mean, a lot of his work sort of focuses on a kind of direct Timurid lineage and legacy, so that you trace it from Central Asia and Iran and the south of it and South Asia, and that's it. So that's one kind of key distinguishing feature. I mean, we have to include the Ottomans in this kind of discussion, and Ottomanists. I'm not the first person to be saying this. I mean, Ottomanists would say this clearly. I mean, the other thing that I would sort of distinguish. I mean, his work is great in thinking about sort of the performance of kingship and focusing on sort of the image and place of the king or ruler in that sense. But I think that, equally important is actually the role of the people around them. I mean, some of these kind of secretaries and chancery figures, because they're the people who actually suggest kind of the range of possibilities about what might make sense to do or to say. And so, in fact, the sovereignty is not simply limited to the work or performances of a king, but actually involves a much more complicated process of interaction, acceptance, rejection, manipulation, and so that's what I'm trying to sort of emphasize here. I mean, I mentioned Selim and Bayezid II or Mehmed II, but they're not at all the focus of the work because I'm trying to sort of highlight this other aspect. Sorry, there was one other question about the concern with Ottoman Turkish. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I didn't really, I mean, Turkish is being written, obviously, in the 15th century, but the big difference, and this is where we can sort of register something of the impact of, let's say, these Persian emigres or this style, is actually the turn that it takes in the 16th century, which is in precisely the same terms, sort of hyper-literate, trying to draw on poetry and the widest array of these kinds of sources in the articulation of whatever it is that the work is trying to do. And in that way, we can't actually sort of trace a kind of trajectory directly of Turkish over the course of the 15th and 16th centuries without taking into consideration these kinds of guys and their kind of work, because you can't get from the sort of simple Anatolian Turkish of the 15th century to this sort of hyper-literate, florid Turkish of Celalzadeh or Mustafa Ali without taking into account this wider context and how Persian in turn is developing during this period as well.
Please.
Yes, Ismail Alatas, MEIS, and I think you already partly answered the question and it is related to what Steps has asked you. But it seems, to go back to your second point, the conclusion, I found that what is very much precious from the works of Babayan and the Safavids or Moin and the Mughal is precisely because they were able to show how these ideas were not simply abstraction, but they were made perceptible and perceivable to the common masses, through performatives as well as material culture and architecture, city planning. So in what way can we actually see this with the Ottoman, or is this just simply in the realm of key terms being deployed in chancellery letters? So to what extent do the common people actually have access to these ideas?
I mean, that's a great question. I mean, that is something that's hard to get at in some instances. I mean, that's where Babayan and Wine have done really good work. I mean, what I would say is, and I kind of hinted at it, but maybe I should have sort of brought it into greater relief. I mean, if we sort of look at how it's being deployed sort of more broadly, we can sort of begin to see glimmers of an effort, let's say, on the part of the state or certain elements within it to kind of project this as a kind of image. So we start with BDC in Tabriz. He's giving, the khutbah, and he's talking about, who Selim is. So there's an effort, I imagine, on his part to sort of project to a public audience what it is that Selim is about. I mean, we also see it in other kinds of references, like I mentioned this victory proclamation of Mohaç, which is also read. I mean, one of the things that's interesting is that that document is in Persian. So that's a document in Persian being read in the khutbah in Bursa, which maybe, which I haven't really thought about it very much. I mean, but the extent to which Persian is understood in Bursa in the early 16th century is an interesting question. I mean, certainly there's a major silk producing, and it's kind of connected with Iran. So that's another kind of instance in which it's being projected. But in some ways, I mean, these things also, and then also law books. These law books which have prefaces are also sort of read aloud and projected to kind of a wider audience. So it's in these kind of few instances that I've sort of identified where we can sort of see that this is actually something that is being projected outward to kind of wider groups. Yeah?
Brigitte Bedos-Rezac, I'm a medieval historian. I'll be returning, in fact, to some of the points made. One had to do with the possible influence of Western ideology on ideas of sovereignty. And I can't speak about this, but I certainly, as a medievalist, am struck by your novel idea of a kind of a divinely inspired form of rulership, which would be very Western. But I'm not so much interested in whether it influenced the Ottoman as whether the Ottomans might not want to deploy this form of ideology in their contacts with the West. You have insisted on their attitudes towards the Islam conquered people, but how about their also connections with the West, which I think are important to them. And the second question also has to do with the focus on the linguistic evidence, documentary and other evidence for this new vocabulary. You touch on chancery habits. So I would like to know whether the actual official documents started to display, beyond the proclamation and so forth, whether the mundane official documents started to include these new terminology, and whether also you have material evidence, numismatic, iconographic, and other, of these new ways of thinking about rulership.
Good. All right. Yeah, those are two very good questions. So, all right. So about sort of influence. I wrote down influence on Western ideology, but that's not really what you were kind of getting at. We're getting at what the extent to which actually the Ottomans are deploying these things, elements of which are clearly sort of shared, at least in the broadest terms, between, let's say, European powers and the Ottomans. I mean, I certainly think that is a possibility. There's another reason why I've tried to sort of focus on a kind of eastward-looking trajectory, and that's because during this period that I'm looking at, yes, they are still involved in westward expansion, but eastward expansion is really crucial. And it's actually this kind of crucial eastward expansion which is in some ways, well, changing the demographic makeup of the empire, but also sort of changing, by extension, sort of who the Ottoman sultans imagine that they are or should be. And so, this very specific vocabulary at this very specific time becomes quite important because it's something that actually emerged from, let's say, the East, broadly construed. And then when they head east, is deployed quite clearly in this eastward trajectory. So that, I mean, that doesn't really sort of answer your question. I mean, we don't sort of see very often in Ottoman sources, I mean, in Jalalzadeh, for instance, in the 16th century, you do sort of see this kind of imperial rivalry between the Habsburgs and the Ottomans. But I mean, he's the one who's saying things like, Ferdinand wants to be Sahib Quran, and I mean, I don't know really what to make of that because it doesn't seem to me to be something that would actually be intelligible or resonate in Central Europe, let's say, in the same way that it clearly resonates in places further east. So I mean, that's the best I can do for that kind of answer. I mean, but it's a very good question. And then about sort of linguistic evidence and where we sort of see it. Yeah, you're certainly right that even so, we are talking about relatively special documents which have a kind of important place sort of in a wider sphere. I mean, one thing that we can note is, yeah, you do not see these terms in numismatic evidence among the Ottomans. I mean, you do actually, to some degree, among the Mughals. The Timurids, you do see mujaddid used occasionally on coins by Shah Rukh in the early 15th century, and also sort of claims to be the caliph, which I think has to be in this kind of theosophical sense and not in a sort of more narrow juridical sense. But I mean, as far as I know, I don't think you see it in kind of numismatic evidence. So I mean, it is something that, I mean, I think that I would have to highlight, this is something that resonates and circulates and is prominent at court and by people, let's say, who are broadly connected with the Ottoman project, sort of as loosely construed as we would want to sort of make that. Yeah?
Jane.
Jane Burbank, history. So in the beginning of your talk, you used the term universal sovereignty when you were talking about the rivals for this in the area. And then I wondered about whether, why you used universal sovereignty, whether there was a contemporary reason for a concept of the universe, in any, or whether this is something that you were using analytically as a kind of sovereignty. And a couple of dimensions of this question, if there is, in these concepts you're talking about, a sense of universe, what is it? What is the universe of this kind of sovereignty? And then secondly, I didn't hear in the discussion certain aspects of sovereignty in this area that I, at least as practice, seem to be extremely important, and that is layering, and also multiplicity of multiplicity of peoples in this, multiplicity of ideas. Most of the discussion seemed to be about a ruler of a more unified, like Islamic world. So, where's
We're the
place,
yeah.
we're the others.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so sort of about universal, I mean, yeah, I am using it as a kind of analytical term, but I think it's in some measure reflected in the way that BDC and others are talking about sovereignty in a kind of conceptual framework. So, you know, that long passage there is clearly sort of referencing sort of the axial role of one individual in a spiritual sense, but that is actually concerned with the broadest cosmic role that individual can play. So in that sense, it is kind of universal, you know, in the way that we might think of it. Yeah, and yeah, I mean, so it's not as if we can sort of identify this term explicitly in these materials, but in terms of the analytical or conceptual handling of them, they're clearly talking about something on the grandest scale. And then sort of about sort of multiplicity or audiences. I mean, that is something that is important, and it's something that I, in some measure, take up in kind of greater detail in the book. I mean, one of the things that I haven't really had the chance to talk very much about is the importance of genre, and what you do in different instances. So, I mean, one of the things that's interesting is that, you know, you can see someone who is a kind of juridically minded scholar, and in a certain kind of document, he limits describing the sultan to sort of traditional certain kinds of terms. But then in another kind of genre, or in another kind of document, that's where all of this other stuff really comes to the fore. And in fact, you know, they should be kind of contradictory. I mean, they shouldn't actually be allowed to do some of these things for very particular reasons. But these people don't seem to have a problem in doing that because they have different hats on at different times. And then here about the kind of multiplicity of the empire, thinking about sort of different populations within it. I mean, yes, clearly the kind of story that I am telling is concerned principally with sort of, let's say, Muslim audiences or largely Muslim populations, but that, I think, is also a consequence of, you know, the particular period and moment that I'm trying to sort of analyze, which is one where they, you know, again, are heavily involved in eastward expansion and legitimizing what it is that they're doing against Muslim rulers. And that's why, you know, this kind of vocabulary really comes to the fore in this moment and in these ways. I mean, you know, there are lots of other interesting examples. I mean, for instance, when they arrive in Syria, you know, some of the Syrian local population is trying to figure out what to make of the Ottomans. And there's a very interesting treatise which is produced by a local Muslim Syrian scholar that is a kind of panegyric of the Ottomans, and he's giving to Selim exactly these same terms. And so that, you know, that shows you in another sense that they are resonating and sort of being reflected back and forth. But I mean, it is one that is a kind of largely, let's say, broadly or loosely Islamically oriented story. You know.
Barry.
I really appreciated your emphasis on the relationship between expressions of sovereignty and aesthetic form. And thinking along those lines, I was wondering whether it really builds on Ismail's question, but takes it in a very different and more elite, if you like, direction. Whether the work of Emine Fadvaju on early Ottoman histories, and especially early Ottoman illustrated histories, many of which show some of the millennial sensibilities that you and Vesper Moyne have spoken about. I'm thinking of something like the Biftai, Jafar Jami, or those. If that body of scholarship is in any way relevant to this, or whether you can connect with it or draw on it.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And so, I mean, well, certainly Fadvaj's work more broadly, I mean, she kind of, like this story, is concerned with, I mean, relatively elite and court-oriented audiences. I mean, but she's looking at a different kind of production, a different kind of aesthetic sensibility, which is, you know, pictorial. You know, insofar as her work references older treatises like Miftah Jafar al-Jami, this is an apocalyptic work which is actually produced in the 15th century, crucially, sort of in the middle of the 15th century, but then kind of it has new life again in the 16th century, where it is illustrated and richly kind of promoted by the Ottoman court. I mean, that is also a part of the story, and there's, I mean, quite a number of Ottomanists who are kind of concerned with these elements and then sort of working along these lines. I mean, I see myself as working in parallel with them. Yeah.
Jackie.
Hi, Zachary Lockman. I was curious about the place that the Safavids play in your story. They've been mentioned only in passing, in a sense. And in the course of the 16th century, they're emerging as a key political and military, but also ideological rival
Yeah.
to the Ottomans. So do you see those processes impacting the kinds of claims to sovereignty and the languages of sovereignty that the Ottomans are deploying, especially given that the Safavids also are drawing on military and universal kinds of
Yeah.
notions of sovereignty and claims to
Yeah.
rule? How does
Yeah.
that fit into your story?
No, that's a good question. I mean, I think traditionally, or in quite broad terms, that's actually how the 16th century is explained. The Safavids represent some kind of ideological and existential threat to the Safavids, to the Ottomans, and therefore the Ottomans have to mimic or copy some of these radical claims. But one of the things that I think is important to keep in mind is that these processes are clearly set in motion before the Safavids really become that kind of a threat, and the Ottomans are dealing with them for other kinds of reasons as well. I mean, to do with the kind of broad processes that I sort of described, and the general vulnerabilities, let's say, that they had in terms of making certain kinds of legitimating claims. So that's the first thing to sort of notice, that the Ottomans have to necessarily concern themselves with this kind of thing, irrespective of the Safavids. As we move into the 16th century, I mean, perhaps we can say that it continues to inform or accelerate sort of how it is that they're doing this as a matter of competition, let's say, or as a matter of kind of deploying equally pronounced kinds of terms that the Safavids are concurrently interested in. But I would sort of say the Safavids don't necessarily, this story would unfold perhaps without the Safavids in the same way. That these processes were set in motion in the 15th century, in the late 15th century, and the Ottomans are taking them on board even then.
Astrid.
I have to be. Austin, this is Middle Eastern and Islamic studies. My question was actually about the Safavids as well, and because what you are showing us is how fascinatingly cross-linguistic circulation of ideas have come to inform and were introduced into the different repertoires of different genres where claims for sovereignty were being made. But to what extent that does translate to the ground in relation to Aji's question to articulating the notion of sovereignty to the people, but also some rival growing forces, because Yavuz was well known for massacring tens of thousands of Alavis. So it's not just what it is also to make a sovereignty claim through Islam, within Islam, is clearly as important as all of these cross-linguistic bearings. And of course, my question, another question would be in relation to this, would be, I'm asking it very fast because I have to go, I apologize, I have to teach. But so the other thing that I was thinking about is how does this compare to when Byzantine intellectuals started coming into the Ottoman court, and some cross-linguistic bearings also happened in there. So, because later on we see the Ottoman language being developed into the scale. So you're showing very nicely how that unfolds. But I was really curious about how that compares to this earlier example on the one hand, and on the second hand, how does that translate to actual acts on the ground when it comes to making claims to sovereignty at war, at rivalry, tensions, massacres.
All right. Yeah. All right. So there's a couple of. All right. So about the sort of Byzantines. I mean, I suppose I would sort of approach that question in kind of similar respects to sort of how I think of Larry's question. Again, if we kind of return to sort of the reign of Mehmed II, I mean, we see sort of incredible activity and engagement along these lines, but it's something that is kind of more limited in, let's say, temporal scope, and that doesn't kind of continue to sort of resonate in the same way into the 16th century as what it is that I'm focused on. And then the other question, yes, I mean, in some ways, actually, I mean, Osla and some others are kind of highlighting the limitations of what I've done here, and in fact, I mean, that's a consequence of sort of focusing on, let's say, the ideological aspect as opposed to the practical aspect. I mean, and that's actually something that I want to work on in the next project, because the two, I mean, of course, are interrelated, but they're just too big to sort of handle together. And so, I mean, one of the things that's quite interesting, if we're sort of looking at kind of practices of rule or governance during this period, is that the Ottomans in some ways are susceptible to the same kinds of vulnerabilities in a practical sense as their less successful rivals in the late 15th century. And so what I'd like to do is actually sort of take the discussion into the 16th century to sort of ask, you know, in this kind of matter of practical governance, are the Ottomans doing anything differently from, you know, what came before? And, you know, generally Ottomanists sort of in the 16th, looking at the 16th century, say the answer is yes. They're early modern, they have a centralizing, bureaucratizing empire that is distinct from what came before. But there are lots of indications. I mean, you can point to some of the things you've mentioned, but lots of others which suggest that it's actually a much more complicated terrain into the 16th century. And this is something that I think will be the next project. Yeah.
So I know that people need to leave to go teach their classes. I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank Chris for such an interesting presentation.